And we have several of my colleagues who will be presenting different aspects of a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation 4 years ago. We are excited to tell you about some of our results, and we do ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll address those at the end. Next slide. I'd first like to just briefly introduce our team. We have a large interdisciplinary team. I'm a sociologist, we have psychologists, we have engineers, geographers, hopefully I'm not forgetting anyone. Oh, and a filmmaker, Troy Hill from MSU. We are across MSU and Clemson University. And as I said, our project was funded by the National Science Foundation 4 years ago. This work developed out of another project that I and a couple of my colleagues did with the American Center for Mobility, looking at workforce impacts of automated vehicles. And unfortunately, at the end of that project, we still had some questions. And I saw this future of work funding opportunity come out from the National Science Foundation, and I thought this could be an interesting way to try to answer some of those other questions. And so I put together this very interdisciplinary team, and we've spent the last 4 years trying to answer some of those questions. Next slide. So WEAVE, what we call our project for short, seeks to understand how autonomous vehicles, AVs, which I'll say going forward, are expected to impact 3 different industries: the trucking, the gig, and taxi driving workforce. So what new knowledge, skills, and abilities are going to be required as AVs become more pervasive and integrated into these industries? And perhaps more importantly, how willing and able are workers going to be to adapt as the nature of jobs may have to change over time? We're also focusing on some of those downstream impacts of AVs in these industries. And then because the pandemic hit about four or 5 months after our project was funded, we've also examined COVID-19's impact on the transportation industry and perception of AVs. So that's kind of a general project overview. Next slide. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our data collection over the past 4 years, and we've collected a lot of data, as you can see from this slide. We have 2 large-scale data collections that have occurred from 20 until 22. We did 59 focus groups with 130 plus drivers, middle management, upper level management in the trucking, taxi, and gig industries. And then just more recently, from May through October of last year, we did a transportation worker survey with over 1,700 respondents. And you can see the numbers that are participated by the different groups there. In addition to those 2 large-scale data collection efforts, we've done a range of others over the course of the past year. So we did a smaller, more in-depth truck driver online survey. We've also done some, looked at some workforce training programs that exist. We've done some case studies, a case study of 8 different truck driving programs. We've done systematic literature review, and we've also incorporated some social media data to look at whether perceptions of gig drivers and truck drivers have changed since COVID hit. So a lot of data. We could be analyzing this data for years. And if anybody wants to work with us, let us know. But I'm going to now turn it over to some of my colleagues and let them tell you about some of our results. So Paige, I'll let you start off.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Hey, everyone. I'm Dr. Paige Watson. I'm an assistant professor in the Industrial and Organizational Psychology program at Auburn University. And I'm excited to kick us off by sharing how our WEAVE findings provide insight into the future impacts of AVs on driving jobs. Next slide. So we'll begin by focusing on our findings for on-demand driving services provided by taxi and gig drivers. Gig driving includes both ride-hailing and delivery services, so you might think about Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Amazon Flex, to name a few. And these gig drivers rely on a mobile app that will connect them with passengers and customers that are requesting their driving services. We also included taxi drivers as a more traditional type of on-demand driving service. Next slide. In response to the onset of AVs, gig and taxi drivers in our samples expected their jobs to undergo significant changes. Themes emerged from our data that highlighted a range of expectations regarding the impacts they expect AVs to have on their jobs. And these drivers anticipated a mix of both positive and negative impacts. For example, on one hand, drivers expressed optimism about how they believed AVs could make their jobs easier and less stressful. However, drivers also expressed concerns about some negative impacts. They feared that AVs might jeopardize their job security, their income stability, or lead to changes in their work hours. Notably, some of these factors, such as safety, were perceived as double-edged swords that had the potential for both positive and negative consequences. While some drivers thought that AVs would offer this promise of enhancing safety through the advanced technology and automation, others were worried that potential glitches or malfunctions might introduce new safety risks. Next slide. We also asked drivers about how they expected specific aspects of their jobs to change, as we have summarized here in this table. So starting with this top line, as you can see, the majority of respondents foresee a significant increase in the use of technology and software in these jobs. And that's going to be that darker purple 55% there, indicating they expected the increase. And there's a clear expectation that AVs will increase automation and efficiency. And this is reflected in the improved ease of working, so that 54% in the second line, the reduced need to determine routes, which would be the lighter blue, so that 36% expecting the decrease in the third row, and an anticipated decrease in work hours, that 40% and the light blue again. So while automation is expected to streamline many aspects of the job, there's still recognition among the drivers that certain tasks, such as addressing unforeseen issues and maintaining vehicles, which are in the next two lines, will still require human intervention and problem-solving skills. And this highlights that drivers expect that it will still be important for them to remain vigilant and adaptable, even if AVs are handling many of the driving tasks. Moving on to the very last line here, views on how autonomous vehicles will impact passenger assistance were mixed, suggesting that drivers expect that there will still be this human element of interacting with passengers that'll play a significant role in their job. Next slide. Building on this, the gig and taxi drivers in our samples reported that they think there will be limits to how well AVs can actually perform their jobs, as they believe this human element will still be needed. In particular, they think that the human component will be important for handling unforeseen issues, maintaining vehicle safety, enforcing policies. This was particularly important during COVID-19, whenever drivers were the main middle person between the company policies and customer behavior. Humans may still be needed to satisfy customer preferences and to complete the front end and back end of delivering services. So these themes really just highlight the complexity of the anticipated changes that drivers expect with the onset of AVs. Next slide. As we moved on to explore the readiness of gig and taxi drivers to adapt to the changing nature of their job, we wanted to get a feel for were they looking forward to this or not. And so we asked them about their perspectives on an anticipation for the adoption of AV technology. And we were happy to see that a significant portion of our drivers, about 83%, expressed some level of anticipation for the adoption of AVs in their industry. And this reflects that general openness and readiness that these drivers expressed towards embracing technological advancements. However, it's important to note that 17% of the drivers in our samples did not look forward to the adoption of AVs. And this segment of drivers may have reservations or concerns about the potential changes or limitations of AVs, such as some of the examples we just talked about, and how they would influence their roles. Next slide. To further understand gig and taxi drivers' willingness to adapt to AVs, we specifically examined their intentions to engage in training. We found that 85% of respondents expected that they would need training to work with AVs, and that they would need new skills and knowledge to be able to stay up to date with this evolving field. And our data showed that there was a positive response from drivers regarding training. Over 2/3 of drivers reported they'd be likely to undergo training if it was paid on the job or if it was offered for free. Still just showing this high level of interest and openness to learning about AV technology. Even more interesting to us, we found that even if the training required payment, 63% of drivers still indicated they'd be interested in this training and they'd be willing to invest in their own education so that they're able to adapt to the changes brought on by AVs. And especially these last two stats here, offer some promising results that drivers are willing to undergo training, even if it involved costs, and that there'd be opportunities for us to upskill and prepare for the transition to working with AVs effectively. And to capitalize on this willingness, it'd be beneficial for companies to consider how there could be accessible training programs that are either free or subsidized, especially for drivers who may not be able to afford those training costs independently. Next slide. Looking at the downstream impact of AVs on gig and taxi drivers, we found that drivers held varied expectations about the impacts of AVs on their jobs, like the examples we discussed earlier, and that these expectations influence their turnover intentions and the extent to which they would want to stay in their job pending these changes. We also found that drivers expressed concerns about being kept out of the loop about the impending changes to their jobs, and that this lack of information or clarity about what the transition of AVs would look like contributes to their uncertainty and anxiety they experience about these changes. Related to this, about a third of our sample reported they had concerns about job security, and they worried that their job about being displaced, and Jenna will talk a little more about this later, with AVs being adopted. And this fear of job insecurity stemmed from uncertainties about how AVs would impact the demand for human drivers and the future of their work. So these findings really highlight the complex and multifaceted concerns from drivers and support the importance of transparency and working with drivers to prepare for the potential changes to their jobs. Next slide. So in summary here from the findings related to gig and taxi drivers anticipate that AVs will bring significant changes to their work, and it will impact the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that were required for them to do their jobs. However, it's important to note that these expectations varied among the different drivers, and there wasn't necessarily a uniformly positive or negative view of what AVs will mean for their work. Drivers recognize the training that there will be training needed to effectively work with AVs, and they expressed a strong desire for training. And this is the positive indication that drivers are interested in being proactive and reflecting their readiness to adapt to these technological advancements. To ensure a smooth transition and improve workforce retention during AV adoptions, companies must proactively address drivers' concerns and listen to what they're concerned about to try to find bridges and what they would like as AVs are adopted. And emphasizing the benefits of AVs, such as the opportunities for safety and efficiency, can help alleviate worries and facilitate a positive transition for drivers. Next slide, and I will pass it on to Sicheng.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sicheng Wang. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. I'm going to present some findings about the future impact of autonomous vehicles on the truck driving industry and jobs. Next slide. We connected the data through the focus groups. We conducted focus groups and we interviewed in total 51 truck workers, including managers, supervisors, and truck drivers. And we cleaned the data, analyzed the data, and we identified two primary themes. The first is unknown. The second is adaptability. Next, please. So the first theme is unknown. There is a widespread uncertainty about the future and the impact of the autonomous vehicles on the truck driver jobs. And workers are anxious about the uncertainty. Most of the workers are not trusting in the autonomous vehicles and don't think they're able to navigate the complex driving scenarios. So, for example, driving through the urban streets or rural streets or different terrains. And they are concerned about the loss of the controls in terms of the emergency situation and complex driving scenarios. And they also concerned about the loss of jobs and the decline of the jobs of the truck drivers. Next, please. The second thing is adaptability. So almost all the workers think that the human drivers need to adapt to the new roles, but the autonomous vehicles will not completely replace the human drivers. So the requirement of driving skills may be lower, and most of the truck driver jobs can be automated, but there is also potentially required higher levels of technical proficiency among truck drivers. Next, please. There are specific concerns about older truck drivers. So because most older truck drivers do not trust autonomous vehicles, don't think the autonomous vehicles can control and can perfectly operate in complex scenarios. And autonomous vehicles may decrease the skill levels requirement in terms of performing the complex driving tasks, but those lower requirements may generate more opportunities for younger truck drivers, because younger drivers are able to transition to the autonomous drive the jobs and perform the driving tasks with the autonomous vehicles. And older drivers may be difficult to transition to the other jobs if they displaced by autonomous vehicles. Next, please. We also found the stereotypes among the trucking industry, because the supervisors and managers and younger drivers predict that the older drivers may be difficult to transition to the era of autonomous vehicles and have a greater problem and reluctance in learning to use the new technologies such as autonomous vehicles. However, we also found that the older drivers generally appear to express similar openness and perceptions of the benefits of the technologies and having not greater problems using the autonomous vehicles. Next, please. So we propose the strategies for older truck drivers. First, we suggest disseminating the benefits of technologies such as the safety and decreasing the probability of crashes or accidents, and also allay the career concern about automation, providing some guidelines for the older truck drivers adapted to the new technologies, and also provide more opportunities to retrain or train older truck drivers to learn the new technologies, and also develop and maintain an age-friendly culture among the trucking industry, and value their experience. Next slide. So in conclusion, AV are viewed as threatening by the truck drivers, and there are needs for drivers to be adapted for the AVs. The roles of driving may be changed, so they are no longer simply the truck drivers, but also the AV monitors and operators. And there is a specific attention should be paid to the older truck drivers. So I will take it, give it to next colleague.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Van Fossen. I'm an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Clemson University. I'm so excited to get to talk about some of the research that our team has conducted over the last few years. All right, so my talk will be focusing on our stream of studies, looking at identifying good fitting potential job alternatives for workers who may be at risk of being displaced by autonomous vehicles. Before I begin, I'd like to note that this line of study has also been pretty heavily influenced by Daisy Chang, a professor of organizational psychology at Michigan State University, as well as certainly all of the members of our Weave team. Next slide. One of the concerns that Paige and Sicheng both noted in terms of how drivers themselves feel about the adoption of autonomous vehicles into their industry is related to job security. And this is a pretty pervasive concern and fear across not only transportation, but all industries that are generally set to see the increased adoption of automation. Although estimates vary, there is the potential for automation to actually fully replace maybe some portion of workers in conducting their current jobs. And if this occurs, given that this is the case, for workers who are displaced by automation but are not yet ready to retire, but maybe need or want to continue working, well, where can they go? Next slide. And our team is focused on trying to answer this concern and help this problem by identifying similar potential good fitting careers for workers who are at risk of displacement from automated vehicles. So we focused on similar careers as potential transition jobs because it may be more beneficial for workers to enter into jobs that have already similar knowledge and skill requirements so that they can capitalize on the knowledge and skills that they've already developed over their career of working in an occupation versus fully starting over at square one. And then it's just as important to try to match workers into jobs that will be a good fit to what they want themselves so that they may be more likely to be motivated, have higher performance, and be willing to stay in a job long term versus constant workforce churn. So this is what we focused on. Next slide. And then in terms of considering similar occupations, how we can compare occupations to get a sense of whether they're similar or not, and maybe therefore able to serve as a good potential transition career. Well, we turn to ONET, which is the US's largest repository of occupational information. So we considered occupational information or characteristics such as things like knowledge and skills required to perform a job, but also things like vocational interests and values, representing preferences for different types of work that a particular job may satisfy. So on the right-hand portion of the screen, we have a screenshot here from ONET Online for the job, the just beginning, information here for that of truck driving. So if you're interested at all, ONET Online is a pretty user-friendly, actually designed website. And you can just go ahead and search for any kind of occupation that you may be interested in that right-hand search button. And you can read through and see what kind of characteristics are deemed important for this particular job. So ONET contains this type of information on characteristics for hundreds of jobs rated by trained job analysts. All right, so this is our primary source of data that we use for this beginning line of study. Next slide. And here are some examples then for knowledge and skills and vocational interests and values. So for truck driving, for instance, truck drivers may need to have knowledge of topics such as mechanical and transportation knowledge and skills such as troubleshooting and time management. We can contrast this with a contrary example, occupation of childcare workers, which is a job that we did not identify as similar to that of truck driving. And we can see here childcare workers instead require knowledge of topics such as customer and personal service, and skills like social perceptiveness, service orientation. So fairly different in this way. Truck driving then also satisfies preferences for working independently and with one's hands and more concrete sort of subjects, whereas childcare working satisfies a desire for working with others, social types of work, and then relationship-oriented work. As some examples of what these characteristics actually mean for truck driving. Next slide. And then for a little bit more context too, as we consider vocational interests, these again represent, similar to work values, preferences for different types of working arrangements. So for example, a worker who has a pretty high interest in a social type of working arrangement may be more likely to be more highly motivated and have higher performance and job satisfaction, as well as more likely to stay long-term in a job that satisfies this preference for social types of work, such as by providing opportunities for them to interact with others. For example, next slide. All right, so given all these various occupational data then that we can use as a basis for making comparisons, our team set up about a few different methods to actually derive or generate sets or lists of potential similar occupations to truck driving as an example occupation. So one of our team members used a statistical method combining a wide array of occupational characteristics and information from ONET to derive a list of occupations that were similar to truck driving on this basis statistically. And we also did a couple of other methods. So one, just looking at and generating a list of occupations that had shared skill requirements to that of truck driving, but then also jobs that were just in the same industry and or shared similar work tasks to truck driving. So we did these 3 different methods. We generated 3 different lists with quite a bit of overlap in jobs that could maybe be similar and thus serve as potential transition occupations for truck drivers who may be at risk of displacement from autonomous vehicles. Next slide. Given these lists, we did a number of statistical comparisons, and we identified that yes, based on a variety of occupational characteristics, the job of truck driving is objectively similar to these similar occupations that we identified on these characteristics. Here we have a couple of examples. On the left, a job that we identified as similar to truck driving, excavating and loading machine and dragline operators, versus on the right, real estate sales agents is an occupation that we did not identify as similar to that of truck driving. At the top of these spider plots, what we can see is that truck drivers have a higher proportion of shared skills compared to real estate agents with truck driving. And then looking at this red circle around the bottom half of these spider plots, a fairly sizable difference that we can see is that our non-similar example job real estate agents have a much greater number of knowledge and skill topics that are not shared with truck driving. So these indicate things that drivers may have to learn or gain proficiency in before they may be able to enter into to perform this occupation. Versus for our good fitting similar job, excavating, loading machine and dragline operators, much faster and more efficient ease of entry in here for truck drivers potentially. So that's an example. All right, next slide. And then we have a pretty wide now list given these methods and comparisons of potential transition occupations for truck drivers. But here are just some examples for you to get a sense here of good fitting similar occupations that we identified. So conveyor operators and tenders, testing specialists and inspectors, automotive specialty technicians, wellhead pumpers, mechanics, crane tower operators, all of these occupations and more. All right, next slide. Okay, so we undertook all this work. We identified lists of potential similar occupations to serve as potential transition careers for truck drivers. And we can report that objectively, our lists of similar occupations are indeed objectively similar to truck driving in terms of these various occupational characteristics, knowledge, skills, interests, values, and more criteria. We also have done some follow-up efforts so we can have more to report about our line of study here. And for one, well, that we did this matching, we found similar jobs that are objectively similar, but how do truck drivers themselves feel or think about these jobs? So we've also conducted a survey with truck drivers themselves, and we're good news, happy to report that we have evidence that drivers likewise perceive our objectively similar alternative jobs to be similar to their work. And also good to note, they also express some interest in these alternate jobs as potential transition careers if needed. So good to note there. We can also say in terms of what may appeal or drive one worker to be more interested in one given transition career over another. Workers are going to differ a bit. We can say that truck drivers may be apparently a bit more interested in jobs that they perceive to be a better match to their abilities compared to others. And then workers may differ themselves too, what attracts them or not to a transition career. So older drivers may tend to be a bit more interested in jobs that they perceive to be prestigious as compared to younger drivers. For examples. Next slide. One of our team members has also undertaken a study to look at the actual geographic availability in terms of job openings among all of our potential similar transition careers that we identified. So these two maps represent different estimates of displacement for truck drivers. And actually what we can see, given the non-fully saturated images along our different states, is that the projected availability in job openings among all of our lists of similar occupations may not be sufficient to meet the actual need or demand of truck drivers who may be displaced and may need to enter into one of these different occupations. So given this, this also suggests that there may be the need for some potential policy support too, to support or ease displaced drivers into be able to enter into a new second transition career. Next slide. All right, and to cap off now, like with some key points to leave you with here, we focused on the example occupation of truck drivers within the transportation industry, but we'd really like to highlight as well that it's possible to apply our methods to identify good fitting potential transition careers for workers who are in any job at all across industries who may be at risk of displacement using ONET data. So wider implications can be replicated certainly for workers in other industries. For some good news too, some starting evidence that seems as though workers themselves may similarly perceive the jobs that we identified as objectively similar to their work, to be similar to their work, and they may be interested in entering into them as transition occupations. Of course, to note, workers may differ in terms of what makes them interested in one transition job over another, for example, based on their age. And geographically across the US, the actual availability in terms of projected job openings for good fitting transition jobs may still be a bit limited, so more support may also be needed generally. All right, thank you for your time. Next slide, and I'll turn over to our next speaker, Shubham.
Hi, thank you, Jenna. My name is Shubham Agrawal. I am an assistant professor of psychology and civil engineering at Clemson University. So until now, my colleagues discussed about the workers' perception of automated vehicles once automated vehicles are out there. In this section, I will discuss about like what are the barriers and facilitators to AV deployment, as well as what are the different types of timeline predictions from different stakeholders like research communities, like industry sector, and also the regulatory sector. Next slide. So the first question is like, why are these AV deployment timelines important to study? As we have mentioned earlier in this presentation, like there are several decisions that companies have to make, that workers have to make, that are dependent on accurate timeline predictions. But there are also several other factors that government agencies or other public sector needs to make, like for example, like making or creating programs for workforce development, or making decisions such as what and when to invest in infrastructure development related to AVs, or just developing some public policies related to automated vehicles. Even at individual level, like workers have to make this decision, as we have discussed, like, for example, truck drivers have to make this decision if they want to transition into some other career or not. And these decisions are really dependent on when the AVs will actually be deployed in the real world. Next slide. So first, we studied the facilitators to AV deployment. And from our data collection, what our workers, like what our participant workers shared with us is that AVs are likely to lower the skill requirement needed for drivers, especially truck drivers. And this may allow younger drivers to join this job with maybe with less experience, but they can still join this truck driving job because the AV might make it easier to drive. Our participants also shared with us that automated vehicles may actually help with truck driver shortages that have been plaguing the industry for over a decade now. From us, we also conducted a systematic literature review, as Shelia mentioned earlier in this presentation. And from a systematic literature review, what we found was that a lot of other studies have identified data collection through public testing of automated vehicles as a key facilitator, because this data can help improve AV safety and just advance the technology that much faster. We also found that a lot of consortiums have been formed in the past few years. So one of these consortiums is AV Safety Consortium. That basically brings in industry partners and public sector together to discuss issues that are critical to AV deployment, such as AV safety regulations. And there have been a lot of partnerships and acquisitions happening in the industry sector, such as Ford and Domino's had a partnership where basically this partnership allowed Ford to get into another operational domain, that what is related to pizza delivery service using automated vehicles. Next slide. We also identified a lot of barriers to AV deployment. So our participants shared with us that they do not believe that AVs will completely replace the drivers from their job. They believe that AVs, at least initially, they will be more about like they will assist the driver, and the driver will still be needed. Even in fully automated vehicle, a driver will still be needed to perform some other jobs. So, for example, in truck driving job, a driver may be required to just maintain the security of the truck or to troubleshoot some of the software issues or technical issues that may arise in automated trucks. Our participants also share that there may be a need for like the drivers would need to acquire new skills that might push some drivers away from these driving jobs just because of this new skill requirement that is needed for this truck driving jobs. From our literature review, we identified several barriers. So one of the barriers was related to public mistrust in this technology. So a lot of studies have been done about public perception of AVs, and overall, like the findings definitely vary across different studies, but overall, most studies agree that there is some sense of public mistrust in this AV technology, and because of this mistrust, they are not sure like when AVs can be deployed at a mass level. Another key barrier that was resonated across a lot of studies was the lack of regulation regarding automated vehicles. And I will discuss this further soon. But in the US, the AV-related regulations are still not matured enough. And one of the reasons is that technology moves much faster than the regulation. And this has created like a gap between like technological advancement and how the regulations are passed. So this has remained a key barrier to AV deployment in the US. Another barriers that were discussed were related to finance. So one of the barriers was that if AVs are deployed, it may lead to reduction in state revenues because AVs may not have a lot of traffic violations or parking violations, which may end up reducing state or local governments' revenues. And also that at least initially, the cost of AV technology might be too high for like for small companies or for individuals to actually purchase AVs. Next slide. So those were the facilitators and barriers to AV deployment. We also studied like what are the timeline predictions from, as I mentioned, from 3 different sectors. So on this slide, I'm discussing the timeline predictions from a systematic literature review of the research articles. So what this graph shows is that let's say if there was a study in 2015 and they predicted that AVs will be out there by 2020, that means that their prediction is that in 5 years from when that study was conducted, that AVs will be out there. And this graph essentially plots all those timeline predictions based on when that study was conducted. And on the x-axis, you can see different levels of automation. So if you're not familiar with the different levels of automation, level 3 is, it's called conditional automation. So Tesla is still level 2 automation. It's still not level 3. So level 3 is like a slightly better version of Tesla. And as we move on to level 5 is a completely or fully automated vehicle where no driver is required for the operation. So in our review, we divided these timelines into two categories. So the first category was like when when the researchers think that technological capability will be available, and the second category is when they think that AVs will be commercially available for public use. Next. So on average, from our systematic review, we found that most studies agree that the technological capabilities for AVs will be out there in 6 to 7 years, while for commercial availability, on average they agree that it will be about 8 years. But one thing to note is that it is not 6.5 or 6.4 or 7.9 years from today. It was from when they predicted. So if a study was done in 2010 and they predicted 6 years, it would have mean that they are predicting that the AVs will be out there by 2016, which did not happen. And I will discuss that further later. Next slide. A lot of the studies also shared their market predictions over the years. So the general agreement that we found in the literature was that by 2030, about 10 to 25% of the total vehicle fleet in the US would be automated vehicles. And this number would grow more than like 50% by 2050. So this was the general agreement across different studies. Next slide. To better understand the industry sector perceptions of AV deployment, we also reviewed a lot of industry predictions like that were published in mass media, like news articles or company press releases. And we summarized these industry predictions in three different sectors. So the first sector is private vehicle sector, which means that if the industry prediction is talking about that individuals can own automated vehicles for private use. The second sector was ride hailing, taxi and delivery service sector. And the third sector was related to technological capability sector. So on average, what we found was that most of these predictions by the industry were below 5 years. And again, similar to the research community predictions, industry predictions were also related to when that industry predicted something. So for example, if in 2015, some industry predicted or some company predicted that the AVs will be out there by 2020, this graph shows that as 5-year prediction. So as you can see from this graph, most of the predictions are below or about 5 years from the industry across all three sectors. But as we can also see that the industry predictions do indicate that technology will be out there first, and then the first sector that will be probably impacted by AVs will be the ride-hailing, taxi, and delivery service sector. And finally, the AVs may roll out to private vehicle sector. Next slide. From our review of these news reports and company press releases, we also found that there were a lot of events within this industry sector that had a large impact on AV deployment timelines. So as I previously mentioned, one of the facilitators was that there have been a lot of key partnerships as well as company acquisitions between like different sectors. So for example, like a technology company might be working with a car manufacturer company, and they might be working with some other companies like Domino's to expand their operational domain. So most of these partnerships and acquisitions were made to either consolidate the expertise between these different smaller companies, or they were made to essentially expand to different operational domains. Other events that we observed were that in the last decade, there have been a lot of public launches of automated vehicles, a lot of public testing, and also a lot of companies received permits to test automated vehicles on public roads. And as I mentioned in the facilitators, these things help these companies to collect more data about AVs, which may make AVs safer. Next slide. Next, we summarized the regulatory scope of AV-related timelines, we summarized the timelines related to AV regulations in the US. And this summary is as of July 2022, and I'm not 100% sure like how many more regulations have been passed since July 2022. But as of July 2022, what we found was there were 43 states in the US that have passed either a legislation or an executive order related to AVs. Next slide. And we further analyze these different regulations. So we categorize these regulations into 6 different categories. And as you can see on this graph, like these categories are essentially related to task force, which is whether a state convened a body that can help advance automated vehicle discussions within the state. The second category was related to insurance and liability laws regarding AVs. The third is related to if the state provided some form of funding or at least provided a way to fund AV development and deployment within the state. Fourth is related to the commercial use of automated vehicles within the state. Fifth is related to whether a particular state allowed some kind of testing for automated vehicles, especially on public roads. And the sixth category is mostly related to technology, which is whether there are some laws related to platooning. Platooning is essentially when vehicles are following each other very closely, especially on a highway. So if there are any laws related to that, because these laws may help advance AV technology that much faster. So from this graph, as you can see, there are two main things to observe from this graph. First is that there were only 4 states that actually allocated funding towards automated vehicles. So like at least from our perspective, we believe that funding represents more like a proper commitment towards AV deployment by a state. So there were very few states as of now that have committed to that level of AV deployment. Second is that if you see, there was a huge boom around 2016, but in these regulatory timelines, but probably because of COVID, but like around 2019, after 2019, the number of regulations that have been passed, they have slowed down in the US, most likely due to COVID-19. Next slide. So to summarize the feasibility and the timeline predictions, the key points that we found were that by the time we were done with our systematic review, which was around September 2022, we found that none of the timeline predictions from the research communities had been met, and also none of the timelines from industry sectors had been met by the time of our review. We also found that, again, from our review, we found that the industry sector had much more optimistic timelines compared to the research communities. As if you recall that the industry sector was expecting that in around 5 years, the automated vehicles will be out there, while the research community is expecting that the AVs will be out there in about 6.5 to 8 years. So one of the possible reason for this discrepancy between the timelines from industry sector and research communities could be that industry sector has they have a potential financial conflict of interest in the deployment of AVs. So this could have biased their timelines to be more optimistic compared to research communities. And regarding the barriers to AV deployment, our literature review indicated that lack of legislation is one of the key barriers that was cited across different sources, different government reports, different research studies. So a lot of different communities agree that lack of legislation is a very critical barrier to AV deployment. And from our review, we also found that AVs are more likely to enter into service markets such as ride-hailing industry, taxi industry, or like food and grocery delivery industries before it is available for private ownership. With this, I will pass it on to Dr. Shelia Cotten to summarize this project.
Thank you, Shubham. All right, we've thrown a lot of results at you today. So here are some quick takeaways, some high-level takeaways. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at the impacts on drivers, and you know, they seem to think that it's going to make their work easier, but they don't ever think that there's not going to need to be a human in that loop. And we were quite surprised at the high percentage that were interested in interested in potential training if needed as jobs were going to evolve, whether it was free or cost a little, or whether they had to pay all on their own. So in terms of drivers, you know, some good, some bad, maybe some ugly somewhere, but you know, they're slightly optimistic and they're willing to think about training to evolve as jobs evolve. Now, in terms of alternatives, you know, we took a range of sources of data and methods to really try to identify what are some of those other job alternatives. And what we saw was that there are indeed, well, one, there is indeed a way to do this and figure out if truckers, for example, like we studied more in depth, are interested in these jobs. And what we found was that, yes, indeed, that they made sense to the drivers, that they could transition into these jobs easier because the skills, knowledge, and abilities were more aligned with what they did in their current job. So there was a good match between worker perceptions of and actual job alternatives. You know, we also found that prestige matters, particularly for older adults or older drivers. And that's not too surprising, is it? Right? You know, I've spent 20 years in academia. I would not necessarily want to go back and, you know, start at a beginning level. And, you know, we're finding this for drivers too. So the prestige of the job will be important as we think about alternative jobs for drivers. In terms of deployment predictions, no timelines have accurately predicted AV deployment. You know, a little surprising, right? Given some of the rollouts that we're starting to see across the country. But we did find that the industry predictions are more optimistic than certainly the research community predictions. And the biggest barrier, of course, was related to state legislation from that systematic literature review. All right, so that's a very high-level overview of the results from today. Next slide. I want to thank NSF again for funding this project. And I also want to thank our Stakeholder Advisory Board. I saw a couple of members attending today, and we're very thankful that you came today and that you've provided great feedback and assistance for us over the years of our project. So if you have questions at this point, if you'll please put them in the Q&A, one of my colleagues will divvy them out to appropriate other colleagues, and we'll try to answer all of them for you. And as several people have asked, we are going to put the slides and the recording of this webinar up on our website and weavensf.com. Right, Liz? Is that the right one? Okay.
That is correct. Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Liz and we'll try to address some of those questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sheila. We have been monitoring the questions that you've been putting in the Q&A, and so I want to go ahead and start to direct those questions to our panelists today. The first question is related to our AV survey, and they wanted to know very generally in the survey how we defined automated vehicles, and if in the survey we specified the Society of the SAE level of automation. So if one of the panelists could unmute themselves and respond to this
Shubham,
question.
do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So in our survey, we mainly defined, like if you have to classify it in the SAE level, we mainly classified it as a level 4, level 5 automated vehicle. So we did mention that it's a fully automated vehicle where the driver role will be, like the driver is not really required to monitor the vehicle. I guess that answers this question.
Great, thank you. Moving on to our second question then. If someone on the team that was involved in the truck driver survey, we had a question that asked how many truck drivers were polled to get the results that we were presenting in one of our opening slides.
So in total truck driver are 16, and we also have 8 supervisors and the rest are managers.
So I think Sicheng is referring to the focus groups. If we look at just the truck driver survey that we did, we surveyed 202 truck drivers to get more in-depth information and to try to figure out whether the jobs that were identified through the ONET analysis actually corresponded with those perceptions of truck drivers. And then we didn't present a whole lot of results from our larger transportation worker survey, but that was 1,704 transportation workers. But all that was not truck drivers. There were a little under 300 truck drivers that participated in that survey.
Great, thank you. So just to summarize, we had information that we obtained from both focus groups and specifically the survey. Moving on to our third question, if one of you could answer this question, it's with respect to, do we bring up mentoring as one of the techniques to help drivers kind of phase into the world of AVs?
Yes, I think so. So training, retraining programs, and also the specific training programs in
I think Sicheng is frozen.
community college the tech however you say, Sheila? Yeah, so yeah, I think so. So
you were frozen on my end. I'm not sure if it was on everybody else's end. I can talk from the focus group specifically. We didn't talk a whole lot about the use of mentoring specifically in the focus groups. I don't recall the participants in the focus groups talking about that much at all. In terms of the surveys, Shubham, Paige, do y'all remember specifically about mentoring?
From the survey, I don't recall mentoring. Yeah, I don't recall mentoring in the survey, in the larger survey at least.
well, we did some surveys and interviews with college, community colleges and technical colleges. And we talk about some mentoring or training programs and that needed for like technology industry and truck driver occupation.
Okay, great. Sicheng, you're breaking up a little bit on your video feeds, so I'm going to give you a minute to check that, and I'm going to direct this question in general to our panel here. They want to know if we did a literature review about workforce development programs around the country, and if so, did we see any states that were leaders in workforce development?
Liz, do you want to talk about the survey and the case studies that y'all did?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about, we did do a survey about workforce development initiatives at community colleges just to find out, are they thinking about AVs? And the answer is largely no. There is a lot of information from the ATA, the American Truck Driving Association, about workforce development trends. A lot of the reports are unfortunately behind paywalls. So if anyone from the ATA is on the call today and would like to share a recent survey about workforce development trends, that would be great. But no states from our interactions with community colleges popped out as particular leaders in workforce development per se. Okay. So I'll move on to our next question then. Do you have data or thinking about working with other regions around the world, Europe, Asia, for example? Have we thought about consolidating data with them or working with them to monitor the evolution of AV adoption and also legislation in those parts of the world?
So I can answer that question. As of now, we haven't. And one of the reasons was that regulations across the world are like the regulatory scene and the political scene across the world is so different that it was really difficult for us to first gather that data like accurately, and second to compare that data to the US. And so, for example, from at least the research that has been published, it's kind of clear that China is leading, and they have a lot of programs coming up for the automated vehicles. But again, the access to the regulations is quite limited, and we cannot really gather that data. We did read up about some regulations across the world, but we did not really summarize them, at least not in a systematic review, again, just because the regulatory scene was so different. So we wanted to focus on the US, at least in this project.
Great, thank you, Shubham. Sheila, this next question is for you, and they wanted to know if any analyses were done for bus drivers, whether that was school bus drivers, paratransit bus drivers, or public transit operators.
When we first submitted our proposal to the National Science Foundation, we had actually included bus drivers, intercity bus drivers, as one of the groups that we were going to focus on. And unfortunately, the National Science Foundation asked us to cut our budget by a certain percentage. And with that cut, we had to cut part of our scope. And so unfortunately, we were not able to focus on bus drivers in the current study, but definitely an area that's still needed. Thank you.
Okay, great. Another question for you all, and maybe we can just go through the panelists one by one very quickly, but what was the most unexpected finding from this research thus far for you personally? So, Jenna, we haven't heard from you yet. Why don't you go ahead and take this one to start?
I was just about to unmute. Okay. Thanks, Liz. So I would say for me, like one of our big findings in one of our manuscripts from our focus group data with truck drivers, and also including looking at managers of truck drivers and supervisors and trucking companies. This is really unexpected, and we weren't expecting, this wasn't something in a research question, but we did find this really clear discrepancy where older drivers themselves seem to report the same, like being interested, seeing positive potential benefits of automated technologies. So, right, even like something that could facilitate them working longer because automation could lessen some of the physical strains of their work, but also being willing and open to learning about new technologies, etc. But when it came to younger drivers, supervisors, and managers, they all tended more to voice, and we think this is due to stereotypes, but voice that older drivers probably wouldn't accept learning about new technologies and would not even be willing to do this or maybe able to do this. So we weren't setting out to find this, but it seems like, oh, okay, yes, it's maybe the case that kind of these age-related stereotypes about older workers could be a real factor, and not just even in transportation, but right across industries set to experience workforce automation, adoption of new technologies, something for industries to look out for and even account for in workforce training, like age bias being a limiting factor. So yeah, that was something we were surprised by, and it is, I think, pretty important for workforce planning and training. Yeah, thanks. All right, how about I'll turn over, Paige, what was unexpected to you?
Yeah, so I'll focus more on the gig and taxi front. And I think one of the surprising findings to me is that we looked at how these different perceptions of AV changes influence drivers' intentions to stay and their intentions to leave their occupation. And we saw a large portion that would like to stay even if AVs are adopted. And so I think at least in some of the Facebook groups I'm a part of and more like casual conversation with people, there can be this perception that oh, if an AV, like I wouldn't want to drive with an AV, I wouldn't want to ride with an AV for the drivers. But we see that they are interested in staying, especially if we can help alleviate some of the concerns about safety and emphasize the lack, how automation can help with safety concerns, as well as try to help seamlessly transition drivers to work alongside AVs as opposed to making them like enemies to one another. So there seems to be opportunity there to do that because drivers are interested in continuing their roles. And I will toss it to Amy.
I think I in depth really analyzed a lot of the focus group data. So one of the things I just found so interesting, especially between the trucking, the gig, and the taxi, is that drivers very much think that they will still be in the vehicle. It's not a perception of that they will necessarily be monitoring a vehicle from afar, but they definitely still see their role as someone needs to be in the vehicle. And so as a result, a lot of them really aren't necessarily planning, like definitely for the gig workers, not really planning in advance of, having an alternative plan if AVs are rolled out. So that's kind of positive that they definitely see their value and want to continue working, but also a potential problem if they're not planning for the future and there essentially is a rollout and which changes their ability to work in that current job.
Great. Why don't we, yeah, I was going to say, if you want to hand it over to the next person. Great, thanks.
Yeah, okay. So for me, not really surprising, but it was an interesting finding that a lot of these barriers and facilitators were really intertwined with each other. So for example, like a lot of our participants mentioned that AVs will lower the skill requirement for the driving job. But then it also reflected that, but as Amy just mentioned that, but the drivers still felt that they will still be required in the vehicle. And also, like, even though AVs are making drivers easy, they're still going to require some other skills that are related to AV. So there was very interesting dynamics going on over there. And another thing that was surprising to me was that in the literature, like there was very few sources where we could actually find any timeline predictions of AVs. Like there is so much literature out there on, yes, AVs will be deployed and what would happen if AVs are deployed, but there is so little on when are AVs going to be deployed. So that was really surprising for me. And with this, I will pass it on to Sicheng.
Sicheng, is your audio working?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. So could you repeat the question again?
The most surprising, the most unexpected finding from your element of the research.
I think the stereotype among workers in the trucking industry, it's surprising because considering the occupational aging in truck driver occupation, this the average age of the focus groups that participants for truck drivers was about 47. So there's a large group of older truck drivers, and but we found the stereotype, the age stereotype would be a barrier for the occupation and also organizations smoothly transitioning to the autonomous vehicles. When because there are a lot of truck drivers, older truck drivers don't trust autonomous vehicles, and they could lack of the resources to transition to another job, and also lack of the resource to get trained for adapted to the autonomous vehicle technologies.
All right. Thank you.
I'll go next.
Okay.
I was really surprised with the focus groups in particular that most of the people that we talked to thought it was going to be 10 to 20 years out before this was really going to be an issue in their interest in their industries. They weren't overly concerned about it. Now, I will say that part of that, I'm sure, was related to the pandemic, which, as I said at the beginning, hit about 4 months or so after our project was funded. So the length of time that they reported, could be related to the pandemic, certainly. I am going to share one other surprising thing. It's not necessarily a result of the analysis that we've done, but due to the pandemic hitting, it took a lot longer to recruit participants for our focus groups. I felt guilty even reaching out to companies trying to get them to participate because they were trying to stay alive. They were trying to keep their people alive, make sure that they, didn't have to shut down completely. And so, it was a stressful time for the industries that we focused on. And, we know that there have been multiple ramifications across the research world too. So I appreciate all my team's effort across the 4 years of the study in trying to continue to be persistent and recruit people for our study.
Okay, thank you, panelists. Let's move on to our next question, which is for Jenna. And it says, it's a great methodology used for matching truck drivers to alternative jobs. Have you considered, however, the probability of displacement of these alternative jobs because of automation?
Yeah, this is such a thoughtful point, isn't it? This would, I think, be a good motivation for a full follow-up study to actually look at and compare. What we can say here, some of our early efforts focused on using ONET data and a large collection of jobs were to construct a potential career transition decision aid for workers who are most interested in minimizing training required and just wanted to enter into a job without having to do any training, or workers who wanted to maximize salary. Here are the potential jobs that might fit that. So this is an avenue of study. We can say it's hard to project based on ONET data. There are different projections people have used, like other occupational repositories and information. But even as of the time when we first generated our list of potential transition careers from ONET data, truck driving was listed as a job with a lot of job openings and a good potential future forecast. And right now, truck drivers are pretty highly in demand. So in terms of the future, hard to say. We have definitely considered this as a limitation of our job sort of sets and matching. What we can do a bit more, and what we'll first kind of the takeaway along with Liz's comparison of geographic availability of alternate jobs. Also too, given the consideration of some jobs that may be identified as a good fit for truck drivers may also be displaced and may have fewer job openings, is that some policy support, some retraining support is gonna need to happen. It won't be a seamless, easy, no training required, can just enter a job with the same skills for everyone. That's probably just not gonna be the case. But what we can do too, even still with ONET data, is looking at a wider list of potential transition jobs. We can still find workers good careers that would fit their interests, values, preferences, so they may be more likely to be motivated, be likely to stay and willing to remain in a job, but they will require some additional retraining to gain the skills, the knowledge that are required to get into a good fitting job otherwise. So it's good. Paige has reviewed some of the attitudes towards training. We can say that will be needed. The availability and fit just aren't really fully there. But ONET alternatives can still be considered. We do have lists of hundreds of potential alternate jobs as well. So some just require more training, but maybe less susceptible to automation. So yeah, it's certainly a great point. All right.
Okay, great. Sure. Shelia posted some information about the report for the American Center for Mobility, which has some information about alternatives. And then there was also a paper the group worked on that appeared in +1 that I put in the Q&A as well. But Sicheng, if you want to talk to a little bit about automation and some other jobs, that also kind of speaks to the question about job alternatives and their prospects.
Yes, in one of our papers, we actually use, in addition to the ONET data, we also look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics employment projection data, which provide, so the employment projection provide annual projections for more than 900 occupations, whether they will be increase or decrease in the next 10 years, and what will be the factors or reasons cause the increase or decrease. So we actually look at the projections and identify the decline in projections automate visual intent. There are some fund also decline with alternative opportunities for truck drivers, gig drivers, or taxi drivers.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Moving on then to our next question, and I think we're kind of if any attendees have questions that they would like to ask, I have another one here. Okay, it's a comment. Thank you for the comments too that are coming into the Q&A. Well, since we're approaching, I think we aimed about an hour and a half. We're approaching the end of our webinar session. I did want to pose a future or a forward-thinking question to all of our panelists, and I'll start off with Shelia, and then I'll let you pass the baton, Shelia. When thinking about the future of AAVs, what is the number one thing in your mind based on project results and in your review of all the studies that are out there that we need to watch out for when thinking about AAV deployment in the immediate future?
You don't start with the easy question, do you, Liz? I think it's hard to identify one factor that I think about. I guess we just have to continue to monitor how legislation and technology and people interact, because one of those can change, and it may upset the trajectory. I don't think it's a clear path. I think it's related to a lot of different factors that are intertwined that are going to affect how quickly we see mass distribution of AVs in our society. And as someone who does not like to drive, I'm looking forward to the day when they're out there and they're available and they're safe.
All right, thank you.
I will pass it to Jenna.
Thank you, Shelia.
Yeah, that is a hard-hitting question, isn't it? I think another consideration is just our sort of societal infrastructure for supporting movement between occupations and career transitions. I think historically there's not been as much focus on career transitions versus just career choice immediately for first-time career seekers, but we're going to have expecting much more career transitions now. This also includes not even workers who are displaced, but workers who, given that their job is changing, may not want to continue, may want to seek another job. So what is our infrastructure for that? That's kind of a factor to focus on, and I think will be also have some good implications across industries too, just given automation as a consideration. All right, how about Amy, would you like to go?
Yeah, I think that really making sure that we are addressing the needs of the workforce in terms of making sure that people who are potentially displaced have backups, and making sure that people are not left without jobs. Automation is a continual challenge in all industries, and so other industries have become more automated and workers have found alternative jobs. So just making sure that that transition period is not too complicated for the workers.
Okay, thanks, Amy.
I can go next.
Read my mind, Paige. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think for me, taking a slightly different approach, not thinking about displacing, but for our focus groups, there was this concern among drivers about not being kept in the loop. And it came up time and time again about the concern was, I'm worried this will happen and I won't even know it happened until it's too late. And I distinctly remember one participant talking about how they were worried to be like Blockbuster, like they were ready to go rent a movie and then bam, it wasn't there anymore. And so being able to keep some sort of transparency or some informational justice with the drivers in these different occupations so that they know what's happening so they can plan as needed, as opposed to kind of waiting till last minute and then being like, okay, great, they're here, and you're not. So having those open lines of communication and transparency, especially in jobs like gig driving, where there isn't that typical like organizational structure where there are managers and hierarchy to help divvy out these decisions, just finding ways for companies to be more transparent for planning purposes. And I think Shubham was going to say something, so I'll go ahead and pass it to him.
Thank you. So for me, and I will echo like what my colleagues have said, I think there needs to be the different sectors like workers, industry, and like academia, regulation. I think they really need to be on the same page if we want AVs to be mass deployed at some point. For example, like we just saw from a review that industries are always more optimistic. And one of the thing is it's good to be optimistic, but sometimes this optimism might lead to, like, if there are some AV related accidents or something else happening, this optimism may lead to public mistrust. So there is really a need to, adjust the expectations of all these different stakeholders together if we really want AVs to be out there. With this, I will pass it on to Sicheng.
Thank you. I think it's important to engage the communities and also the large public in the process of deployment and development of autonomous vehicles, because that they are also like considering the workforce impact. They are also a part of the impact. Because drivers, truck drivers, gig drivers, and also taxi drivers, they mention a lot that how they don't know, they are uncertain how the autonomous vehicles will deal with like pedestrians, other road users, and community residents. So I think it's also important to engage them in the process of deployment and in development.
Great. So I think we heard from all of our panelists. We have one more question and then we'll wrap up. And that question is, what is missing? So someone said more than 43 states have passed legislation about AVs. So given the number of states that have passed legislation, why is this still considered a barrier to AV deployment, and what needs to happen from a legislative perspective to maybe move AV deployment forward?
Yeah, I can take that question. I was actually about to answer that question in the chat. But so although 43 states have passed some form of legislation, a lot of these legislations are not really doing enough for AV deployment. And also for AV deployment, like we don't really need just there is not going to be just like one legislation and then AVs are deployed. We need a variety of different aspects that are addressed through these legislation. So a lot of the regulations that we saw were like related to task force or insurance and liability or testing, right? So these legislation, although they may advance the AV deployment a little bit or just advance the timelines a little bit, we are still far away from actual mass deployment of automated vehicles. We would need a lot more legislation, a lot more careful consideration of what are the issues related to automated vehicles, and especially different states have different needs. So that also might need to be considered in these legislation. So in short, although there are 43 states, most of the legislation is not really concrete enough to pave a way for automated vehicle deployment at this stage. We need a lot more legislation than that.
Shubham, isn't there some concern, I know you can speak to this, isn't there some concern as well about coordination between states in terms of variation in legislation?
Right. So that's a very good point, because in our review, we did find that a lot of the criticism about these legislation is that there is no federal level legislation. And because transportation is so interconnected between states, like let's say we are talking about trucking industry. So a truck might go from, I don't know, Montana to Texas, and they have to cover a lot of states in between. So if all these states have different legislation, it's really almost impossible for that truck to operate in an automated way throughout its journey. So yes, there is a need for either, like, at least I believe personally that federal level or the federal government needs to either coordinate all these states together somehow, or they need to come up with some legislation on their own that can be imposed on these states. But I don't know how easy or how difficult it is, so I wouldn't like comment on that part. But that seems to be one of the barriers.
Great, thank you, Shubham. Sheila, there's actually one last question I think you could probably answer before we wrap up here, but that was about extending our research to other types of transportation, such as public transit and other passenger transportation, whether that be passenger rail, interurban transportation systems, etc. And if we extended it to these other types of transportation, would we expect similar results?
So we've certainly talked about extending the research. At this point right now, we're in a period where we're really focused on analyzing our current data. Like I said, we haven't done a whole lot with that large scale survey that we did. And so at least for the next probably year, we're going to be focused on continuing to analyze our data. I think it's definitely a possibility for the future. You know, if our team is interested in continuing and trying to seek alternative funding to focus on some of these other areas, I think, you know, we have a great team and it'd be wonderful to continue the research. And in terms of would we expect the results or themes to be similar? I don't know. You know, there's been a ton of literature that's looked at public perceptions in general, particularly of, you know, passenger AVs, and, you know, what predicts whether people are favorable or not towards that. So I'm not really going to speak on that, I guess. So I don't know. Do any of my other colleagues have thoughts on whether we would expect the same findings or different?
The only, I will say the only thing that, you know, that really continued to get repeated in the focus groups were drivers of all the industries always referenced railway systems and also airplane systems in terms of being automated systems where there's still a person, like a driver. And so that was, I think, a reason why they all still their perspective was that they were still going to be in a vehicle, even if it was an automated vehicle. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amy. All right. Well, we're about at the end of time, and I don't see any more questions in the chat, but thanks to everyone that did put questions in the chat or provided comments or extra resources. And thank you to you all for attending. I also want to make sure to thank the National Science Foundation who funded this project, the members of our stakeholder advisory board, and all the drivers, gig drivers, taxi drivers, ride-hailing drivers, truck drivers, who took time out of their day to provide us with information, to share insights into their work and their lives, especially during the very difficult time of COVID-19. So with that, we will end our webinar for today, and thank you all for attending. We'll be sending you a follow-up email with information about where you can find this recording and also more information about our project. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.